It's Friday, and it's 10 o'clock. I'm Tim Harris, and that means it's time for 10 with Tim. Each morning, Monday through Friday, we spend about 10 minutes in the Word of God going verse by verse, right now through the Gospel of John. And I'm glad you're with me. Some of you are with me every single day, if not live, at least later. And I thank you for that. It really means something to me that we can spend this time in the Word together. So Elaine and John and Linda Clark and Jim and Pixie and Eli and Evan and Jan, Barbara, Elaine, all of you who are just so faithful. Thank you so much. Facebook, YouTube, all of you. Don't forget once in a while to drop a comment or a like or subscribe to the page. All of these things help content like this float to the top of Facebook and YouTube. And we all know that social media needs a little more of this kind of content. So if this is what you like to see and you get tired of seeing the other mess, and if you'll interact with the content that you enjoy, you'll begin to see more and more of that. That's how it works. What we're looking at today is kind of the epilogue, if I can use that word. It's the summary, in a sense, of Jesus's public ministry in the Gospel of John. When we come back on Monday, when we pick up in chapter 13, it's going to be a very, very different kind of drama. When the curtain closes and opens again, we will be in the upper room, and you're going to spend more time in the upper room than you ever imagined. John goes on for chapter after chapter after chapter of Jesus in the upper room with his disciples. But before that, there is this sort of a final verdict, if you will. Remember, the Gospel of John is itself sort of like one big courtroom procedure, a trial. And there is a decision to be made, and the decision is yours, the reader. And there is testimony that is brought forth, and in this case, kind of a final verdict here on the Jewish people. And the verdict is bleak. In verse 37, it says, despite all the miraculous signs that Jesus had done, most of the people still did not believe in him. I don't know if you expected that to come after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where it seemed like the whole city, even the Pharisees said the whole world's going after him. But remember what it said early on when Jesus saw that people were trusting in him, but he didn't trust them because he knows how people are. You understand? So despite the fact that there's the appearance of this incredible movement toward Jesus, it's going to be very short-lived. And this is the final verdict. This is the truth. Despite the fact that they saw a lot. For all that they saw, it did not end in belief. Remember, this incredible tension all through the Gospel of John between seeing and believing. And this is that verdict here. They saw, and even though they saw so many miraculous signs, it did not lead to belief for most of the Jews. Now, why is that? Why is it that when the Word becomes flesh and dwells among his very own people, his people do not receive him? How do you explain that? Well, in this moment of final verdict here, John takes you back to the Old Testament to give you sort of an understanding. There's a context for their disbelief. There's a context for their hard-heartedness. And the Gospel of John here just wants you to remember that there's nothing new about this. He goes all the way back to the prophet Isaiah, to chapter 53, which is one of the messianic prophecies, right? And that chapter begins, Lord, who has believed our message? You've probably heard that verse before. You've heard that passage. Lord, who has believed our message? It's one of those rhetorical questions where the answer is nobody. Nobody's believed your message. I mean, that's the point. Who's believing? Nobody's believing. And this is at Isaiah 53, that amazing chapter that talks about how the suffering servant came up in obscurity and suffering, and nobody saw him, and nobody recognized him, and nobody received him. So this is Isaiah way back in the day, who could see Jesus, could see that messianic moment coming. And even then, the prediction is nobody's going to listen, nobody's going to believe. Because they didn't listen to Isaiah, right? And they didn't listen to any of the prophets. The people of God have always had so much to see, so much that they could anchor their faith in, and yet they choose not to believe. They've received so much light, and yet they persist in darkness. So John wants to draw a straight line from the unbelief of the people in Jesus's day to the unbelief of the people all through salvation history. Most people have never believed. Most people have seen and still walked away. So this is what John is doing. He's trying to help you connect the unbelief of the Jews in Jesus' day to the unbelief of the Jews all through salvation history. This has been a theme. And all the way since back in the days of the prophet Isaiah, you could say, they've sort of lived under this kind of judgment. The judgment that comes with seeing but not believing, hearing but never really listening. And so there's a hardening that goes with that. Once you continue to say no, every time God continues to reach out to you, it just becomes easier to say no. And then you just live in this hardened resistance. And this is what John is describing. And this is what he wants you to understand. There's a point after you've said no for so long that you really can't even say yes anymore. It becomes established. It becomes settled. And this is what John is describing here. The Lord has blinded their eyes. The Lord has hardened their hearts. It goes back to sort of like when we were reading Exodus, remember? And Pharaoh would harden his heart, and then the Lord would answer that by hardening his heart. It's the same sort of thing that happens in the hearts of people. Now, understand, lest you get carried away and go too far with this kind of language, it is not insinuated here, and neither does John suggest, and I don't think the original audience would have understood that we're being told here that there are people that God chooses for condemnation, that God chooses and hardens and prepares some people simply to go to hell. I don't believe that, and I don't see that being taught here, because notice you have to contrast this idea that most still did not believe, but in verse 42, many people did. Many people did. So despite the fact that they're in this kind of judgment based on the tradition of unbelief of the Jewish people, it is still paramount that they hear the word of the Lord, that they see Jesus and they believe in him. They can come out of that unbelief into belief, but they have to make a choice. And this is what the very coming of Jesus represents, this moment of truth, this moment of decision. You can either persist in the rejection and the resistance of your parents, your grandparents, or you can choose to break this cycle. And this is what John is pointing to. And this is how it's described. Isaiah was referring to Jesus, John says, when he said this, because he saw the future. And he was speaking of the Messiah's glory. Verse 42. Now, many people did believe in him. See, it's not this, ironclad, predestined condemnation. He says many people stepped out of this because they believed. Now, let me go on. I want you to see this. But they wouldn't admit it. Some of the people, even the leaders, were probably believers, but they wouldn't come out. They wouldn't go public with that for fear that they would be expelled from the synagogue. Now, I just want you to sort of connect this. When John is writing, understand, when the Gospel of John is eventually written, it's later. Not much later. It's still in John's lifetime, but understand, it's later, and it's after the point where the Jews really are beginning to put Christians out of the synagogue. And this increase all through the first century. And by the time John writes, probably in about the year 90, the Jews have already had the Council of Jamnia, where they officially codified the expulsion of Christians from the synagogues. And so John here is including this detail for the sake of his readers so they can connect their situation where the Jews continue in the hardness of their hearts, in their disbelief, in the rejection of Jesus, to reject those who would take Jesus' name. So you'll see this several times. Back in chapter 9, verse 20, when the parents of the blind man, do you remember that? The parents of the man born blind, they were afraid that they would be cast out of the synagogue. It's that little thing, that little detail that John keeps including for the sake of the church, the first readers of his gospel who are experiencing this very thing. So John is sort of fortifying them, helping them understand that what they're suffering, they're not the first ones to suffer. Verses 44 through verse 50, this last part is kind of Jesus's last statement, in public ministry. And go back and read that. It echoes so much of the prologue. If this is an epilogue of his public ministry, it goes back to John chapter 1, the prologue, where the light has shined into the darkness. The darkness hasn't overtaken it. The darkness hasn't comprehended it. Jesus says in verse 48, I don't speak on my own authority. The Father who sent me has commanded me what to say and how to say it. And I know his commands lead to eternal life. So I say whatever the Father tells me to say. Again, Jesus is making clear, you reject me, you reject the Father. You receive me, you receive the Father. But there is no other way to the Father except through Jesus. And that is going to be underlined and stressed in the chapters to come. Again, that's kind of the end of Jesus' public ministry. When we come back, it's going to be a private scene in the upper room with the disciples. It's a scene that's familiar if you've read the Gospels, but I want you to read John's description closely because, as I'm going to tell you, John knows what you know. He knows you've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so he always sort of fiddles with those expectations to help you understand the truth of who Jesus is. So if you think you've read it before, you ain't read nothing yet. We're going to jump into John chapter 13, verses 1 to 17 on Monday morning at 10 o'clock. So join me there. If you don't have a church home, or if you're currently not attending church in person, remember that Woodburn's services are going to be streaming live on Sunday morning. We have 8 o'clock, 9:30, and 11 here at Woodburn in person, but also you'll find services streaming during those hours on Facebook or YouTube right here where you are. If you ever have a need, you can reach out to me or reach out to Woodburn Baptist Church. We love you and I love you. Thank you for your faithfulness. Stay in the Word, stay in good health, stay warm, and Lord willing, I'll see you Monday morning at 10 o'clock for 10 with Tim. Have a good Friday.